Good afternoon, Beltug members, ladies and gentlemen. I see that our members are trickling in. This is a highly popular session, as you'll see in the next slides. Let's immediately start in this session about the Data Act and especially about data sharing. First, before we dive in, a few housekeeping rules for this for this online meeting, just to make sure that everything runs smoothly. Can we ask you to keep your microphone muted and your camera off during the presentations? Later on, when it is time for Q&A, then I'll ask you to open your mics and to open your camera so that we have the feeling of an interactive discussion. During that Q&A, if you have a question, you have a comment, then can I ask you to use or the chat during the presentations or to raise your hand to make sure that I pick up on your question, and then start your comment or your question with your name and the company you represent. This meeting is being recorded and that recording will be published. That is only the presentations are shared in that recording, the sound and the video, not the group chat, not the participants overview, and in the post-editing, we cut out the moments of discussion and the Q&A. But the presentations in itself, they are being recorded, and that recording will be available to our members online. So with your login on our website. Important for all of our Beltug meetings, it is prohibited to use AI bots for any purpose. So not for your recording, not for your summarizing or transcription. We really feel that confidentiality during our meetings is important. So the usage of AI bots is forbidden during this meeting. As I said earlier, if you have questions, if you have comments, then use the raise hands feature, or you can already type your question in the chat during the presentations. I'm Anne Guinet, and together with my colleagues Danielle and Marieke, we hope you have a fruitful session about the Data Act this afternoon, and we hope you gain plenty of inspiration. As I said at the start, look how numerous you are today. Our members community is eager, very eager to know about the Data Act. Mid-September, that is only 2 months ago, the Data Act came into effect on Friday, the 12th of September. And that Data Act is a true game changer in a good way. For starters, with the Standard Contractual Clauses for cloud computing contracts, clauses that focus on switching clouds and exit from a cloud. We talked about that mid-October. I'd say have a look at our website for the replay of that session and the slides that have been shared. And also a game changer because the Data Act introduces new rights and obligations to make data access and usage more fair and more transparent across industries. The Data Act unlocks new business potential as it empowers users to request data from manufacturers and share it with third parties. And first of all, I'm happy to share a piece of good news. Last week, Thursday, so very, very recently, the 20th of November, the European Commission has published the model contractual terms on data access and use and the standard contractual clauses for cloud computing contracts. The Data Act itself, as I said, is already in effect since 12th of September. Yes, these MCTs, abbreviated, and SCCs are key in the implementation of that Data Act. These texts are final. For now, they are only available in English. The European Commission expects the other languages to be ready in March 2026. So don't be confused by the term draft on this web page. Once all languages are published, the status of the text will go from approved to adopted, and then the word draft will be removed. So let's explore how the Data Act defines and regulates that sharing of data and how that can be beneficial to companies and organizations. Because as our president Claude Rapoport stated during our VIP evening earlier this year, more than other regulations, the Data Act intends to create new business opportunities. By the way, you can read Claude's entire talk on our website. I'll share the link in the chat in a few minutes. And Claude was one of the members of the expert group that drafted the Standard Contractual Clauses and Model Contractual Terms for the European Commission. He represented 4 European CIO associations in that expert group: the French SIGREF, the German Voice, the Dutch CIO Platform Nederland, and our very own Beltug. 3 years of thorough work, meetings and consultations, also intense discussions with the cloud providers, hard work. So we are very pleased with the outcome and proud of our president. I'd say give him a virtual applause in this meeting. Then today we dive into the world of that data sharing, as I said. Erik Valgaeren from law firm Stibbe starts us off with an overview of the Data Act and the provisions that we find in there on data sharing. And he'll also glance through the potential opportunities and pitfalls for organizations, as I come with good news, but there are still open questions when it comes to the Data Act. Then Kalman Tiboldi will take us through the story of GemOne. GemOne is a digital spin-off of TVH and how it uses industrial data collected from smart machines, from smart machinery. And then during the Q&A and the speakers panel at the end, Peggy Valke and Stefan Vijverman from BIPT will be available to answer our questions, your questions. You know, BIPT has been named in the Governance Coalition Agreement, in het Regeerakkoord, as the probable regulator for the Data Act. So that is why we invited BIPT to this session as well. We wrap up this session, just a practical note, at 3 o'clock this afternoon. And again, this is a Beltug session. I can't emphasize this enough. Do ask questions, make it interactive, share your concerns, your questions, be critical. You don't always have to agree with one another. You can really talk from your perspective. And then when taking the floor, please first state your name, your function, and the company you work for. And take the liberty when you have a question and you don't find the exact wording in English, feel the comfort to ask your questions in Dutch or in French. And if you pick up on something interesting, of course, we love you to share. If you do so, use the hashtag Beltug or tag Beltug in your post and share the inspiration that you find during this session with your broader network.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's always a pleasure to be amongst friends, and Beltug for many years has been exactly that platform to me. I also see it reflected in the panel composition for today. And I also want to congratulate Claude on the work done for the MCCs. I was very happy to be part of the expert group assisting him on that. I think it's excellent news that we finally get to concrete results there. And you referred to the Data Act as a game changer. I would definitely agree. But for us in the legal practice, I think with the Data Act, the European lawmakers have thrown us a curveball, as the Americans say, because it is indeed a challenge. It's something that we need to get our head around. And I think it's good, before we hit the use case that Kalman has prepared, that we have a few words of introduction, a framework that allows us to reflect upon the opportunities of this new instrument. It's a paradigm shift because it allows us to look at data through another lens. Up until now, we thought about data often as a liability, something that needed to be protected, something that we needed to be very, very careful with. And that's a philosophy that we find with respect to personal data reflected in GDPR. Here, both in the Data Act, also in the preceding Data Governance Act, data is clearly earmarked as an asset, as something that we can actually use to build out our economy, introduce new business models. And as already pointed out by Anne, this instrument has become applicable since the 12th of September. I know that there's a lot of non-lawyers in the session. It's an act which basically indicates that the legal instrument used is a regulation compared to the older way of harmonizing legislation in the European Union, where we'd use a directive, and a directive always needed to be transposed into national law. With a regulation or an act, we are a step further because these rules are automatically applicable in each of the 27 member states' legal environment. So that's a big plus for Europe. We create a level playing field. Now, in a nutshell, and the Data Act is quite a piece of reading and literature, but I tried to kind of keep this a little bit visual and structure it a little bit for the purpose of today's session. Overall purpose, as I said, it's about removing barriers, securing fair access to data, and facilitating the use of data. And we will see in the Act that there are a number of pillars in there, a number of chapters that each have a specific focal point. The first one, and that's one that is definitely relevant for today's session, it's about B2C and B2B data sharing in the space of what we call IoT, the Internet of Things. It's about data related to connected devices. And we find stipulations in there regarding the right to access those data for the users of the devices, but also the right to share this data with third parties. A second part of the Data Act deals with mandatory disclosures. A number of situations where a data holder will be obliged to share data. A third pillar is what we call the unfair terms, because when opening up this market for data, when promoting this sharing, it is also essential that this is done on the back of contracts that are fair. And in order to steer that, there is a list of so-called prohibited clauses, that's the blacklist, and a list of so-called presumed illegal clauses. So there is a presumption that can be rebutted. This is a gray list of clauses that we find in the Data Act. And then, and this is very important for the cloud business, the switching chapter. It's a set of rules that deal with the delicate situation of a customer wanting to switch from one cloud operator to another, and how this can be achieved in a fair way. In addition to these four major topics, we also find some provisions in the Data Act that deal with international data transfers, with interoperability, and then the oversight and the enforcement. These elements will be less relevant for today's session, but they're definitely part of the Data Act. If we focus a little bit more on the IoT part of what is happening in the Data Act, and this is supposed to be a bit of a springboard for the use case that Kalman will present after me, it's clearly about innovation because it's about facilitating access to data, making data related to connected devices available to more players, more actors, and stimulate innovation of products and services. So it's about efficiency and collaboration. It's also about fostering competition because we will actually stimulate a secondary market for complementary products and service. Think about after sales services, and we thereby also have more choice for a user to go to the actor of his or her choice for these services. This is the perfect transition also to underscore this idea of more empowerment for the user, so less dependency on the vendor or the initial manufacturer of the device. There is clearly an idea of fostering digital transformation because we kind of bring an acceleration into the market by facilitating the access to these data, and we allow for new models and new services to be developed. And finally, it's really also about fueling the economy because we will have data markets that are being explored as we speak with monetization of data and where actual profits can be made. So this is all part about what the IoT business opportunities are in connection with the Data Act. If we now zoom in a little bit more into the structure of the Data Act, we see also in conjunction with the pillars, which I mentioned a few moments ago, and this is a more kind of visually sliced lasagna of the different chapters. We see that this is reflected in the structure of the Data Act. We have the chapter 2, which is really about the IoT data sharing. We have chapter 3, which is about the mandatory data sharing. There is the chapter 4 on unfair contractual terms. And then there is the B2G data sharing, which again will not be very instrumental for today's session, but is definitely a relevant part of the Data Act. Today, we will focus on the IoT data sharing, which is chapter 2. But once you realize that there is an obligation to share data in the IoT context, and that is the lower bullet on the left-hand side, so there's mandatory data sharing, that this also will make chapter 3 then relevant because chapter 3 tells us how mandatory data sharing needs to be organized and implemented. So the consequence of the mandatory nature of the IoT data sharing is that chapter 3 will also be triggered, and chapter 4 will be relevant for the contract terms that we will use when we stipulate the underlying agreements for IoT data sharing. Interesting for the contracting part is that this chapter 4 will apply as of now, already since the 12th of September, to all the new contracts that we would make. And as from 12 September 27, it will also apply to the then existing contracts, provided that they meet 2 conditions. I will touch upon that in a later stage. So for IoT data sharing and contracting, chapter 2, chapter 3, and chapter 4 are relevant. Now, don't be too dazzled by this slide, because at first sight, it could look a little bit like the electrical scheme for a nuclear power plant or something. But we found this slide to be useful to illustrate the flow of the IoT data sharing contract parts. And I will explain this slide, but also use it as a way to then kind of divide it up in 3 scenarios, 3 parts that you will recognize in this overall scheme. We will zoom in on each of the three later on. But so the story of IoT data sharing starts with a manufacturer, who typically, not exclusively, but typically, and for these purposes and intents, will be considered as the data holder, manufacturer who has devised and manufactured a connected product or a related service. This could be an iPhone, it could be an electrical car, it could be an intelligent fridge. Most cases of IoT talk about intelligent fridges, but I yet have to meet the person who has such a fridge. Nevertheless, it's an example that is often used, and this device is bought by a user. First thing that is relevant here is that the Data Act already requires the manufacturer from the beginning, from the design of the product, to clearly integrate a number of principles. So all the rules relating to access and use facilitation need to be already onboarded at the level of the design. This is something that, for example, we also find in the GDPR, where there is a privacy by design requirement. Here, this is being extrapolated to a data access by design requirement. But back to our storyline. So we have a user who buys a connected product or who requires a related service from a manufacturer who, because of the fact that he controls this set of data, would be considered the data holder. And in the contracting path, this brings us to a first level of contracting, i.e., between the user and his data holder, a contract needs to be established. Sometimes, we will talk about that a bit later, there will be a negotiation. Sometimes maybe the negotiation will be a little less because of the fact that the user would not have a lot of leverage, but the modalities and the conditions for the access and the use and certain restrictions need to be stipulated in this contract underpinning this relationship. And the idea of this contractual set of rules and of the rules that are mandatory and that are provided for in the Data Act is that this data holder has a number of rights and a number of obligations. As to the rights, the data user would be allowed, as provided by this contract, to use the data, for example, to make aggregated data available to third parties. That's something a data holder can do if this is allowed, if this is foreseen under this contract. And the data holder can also use the data generated by the device, and obviously across all the users that he has in the portfolio, to develop new or improved functioning of product or related service. So he can actually develop his product or services on the back of that. That's in terms of the rights. In terms of the obligations, the Data Act stipulates that the data holder has to make these data, the data relating to the connected device and the use made thereof, has to make it available to the user. And then there are two ways of doing that. Either there is a direct access that is given to the user, and that is an access that needs to be accommodated or needs to be granted for free, or it's an indirect access. An indirect access meaning the user will not himself or herself want access to those data, but the user will require or request the data holder to share these data with a third party. For example, an alternative provider of after-sales services or an entity that can make use of these data to assist the user in another segment of its activities. And so at the request of the user, the same data holder will then in an indirect way grant access to the data to a third party. And so there again, you will have a scenario where there is a contract required, i.e. a contract between the user and the third party to accommodate the third party's request of these data and receipt of these data from the data holder. So that's the scenario 2 contract. It's a second stage contract. And then the third party, when exercising the authority it has received from the user, will actually go to the data holder to get the data on the back of yet another contract. And that's the scenario 3 that we will look into in a moment. And this third party, as I said, can use these data to provide a service, to sell non-personal data. This will all be function of the agreement this third party has with the user, and the service that it would develop can be either, as I said, an aftermarket service, or it can be a related service, in which case this third party will obviously also become a data holder and can actually be put again in square one, where the user would have the same rights vis-a-vis the third party. You'll see, by the way, other than the 3 scenarios, you see a number of light bulbs, which are points that trigger questions today. Actually, there are a lot of questions that we still have from a legal perspective. And I know from having chatted with Kalman that there are very many questions as well from a more business perspective. But so these are already a number of questions that I will try and flesh out later on during my presentation. So if we now focus on the 3 different scenarios which I introduced a moment ago, the first one, the first contract dimension, is the one between the holder and the user. And as I said here, the question is already, what is the level of negotiation that can occur? Obviously, if you're talking about big companies, big players, and you have consumers, for example, then the leverage of the user will be minimal. And rather than having negotiations, we presume that there is going to be a lot of standard terms and conditions that will be pushed upon or towards the user. But the scope of this contract would be the access, direct access, or the accommodation of access requests if it is about facilitating a third party on behalf of the user to get to these data which are kept by the data holder. In terms of applicable chapters, as I said, this is clearly within the scope of chapter 2. So we are in the area of IoT data sharing. A data holder who has these IoT data, who has accumulated them, and giving then the right to the user to access and to share. What is important for the contract? The contract would need to cover at least these items which I've listed, the access modalities. And you see here, just like the former mayor of Antwerp, now and then it's nice to use some Latin. This is actually used within the doctrine relating to the data act in situ or ex situ. In situ basically means that the access is provided within the IT environment of the data holder. For example, in the app itself that you as the user have, you can find the relevant data. Ex situ would be that you get these data in another way. You get them outside of, and you get a data file that is transferred to you or to your third party that you have mandated. So that's the difference between in situ, ex situ. As I said, this needs to happen free of charge. The data sharing with third parties upon request is something we would cover in that contract. The possibility for the data holder to compensate the user for additional use that the user would authorize the data holder to make of the data. the format, the quality, the exclusive or not exclusive nature of the sharing, whereby obviously non-exclusive would be the rather privileged starting point. If there's personal data involved, GDPR dimension needs to be tackled, because when we talk about data sharing, it's any kind of data. So both personal and non-personal data will definitely be involved. So we would need to also onboard the GDPR attention points. The holder would need to stipulate the TOMs, the technical or organizational measures that it would take to protect the data. The permitted users would need to be described, and the restrictions of what the user actually can do once he or she has access. For example, the Data Act forbids that these data would then be used to develop products or services that are competing with the one that the user is acquiring from the data holder. There's also a very strict regime relating to trade secrets. If the data are covered by trade secrets, they cannot be shared unless certain warranties have been negotiated and stipulated in the contract. So this would be the impact of Chapter 2 on this type of contract between the data holder and the user. As I said before, since this is about mandatory data sharing, also Chapter 4 on the unfair contract terms would be relevant. And this would mean that a number of clauses that are either part of the blacklist or of the gray list need to be avoided. And what is important when we talk about unfair contractual terms, this is about terms that are unilaterally imposed. They, of course, relate to access and usage of data. That would be the scope of what we're looking at. And we consider them unfair when they deviate from good commercial practice. So this is what we need to have on our dashboard when we deal with the contracts. This is a practice that is still kind of new. So these are contracts that are still being devised and definitely will need to be tested before courts. The second scenario, this is then the contract between the user and the third party. If the user wants to involve another repair service, for example, to deal with his or her product, then this contract would also need to accommodate certain items, similar clauses as the ones I just mentioned, also some extras to include, namely how to deal with the request to the data holder, because the third party can directly from the data holder then seek the data required. And this will properly, over time, result in a lot of connections and interfaces being built between systems and databases, but there needs to be a contractual underpinning. And then the third party can also sell aggregated and derived data, but this third party needs to respect the same restrictions as the ones I outlined before and that play out for the user. For example, the third party cannot use the access to these IoT data to build a competing product, and the third party will also need to respect trade secrets or carve-outs on data that are covered by trade secrets if the third party is not in a position to guarantee the confidentiality of those trade secrets. Here again, the chapter on the unfair contractual terms will play out, and the same limitations will apply. And then we can move on to our third contractual dimension, which is then the contract between the data holder and the third party. So once the third party has been properly instructed and mandated by the user, the third party can actually connect with the data holder and obtain the IoT data. This will often, as I said, be triggered by an initiative from the user, who will first instruct the third party to go and seek those data. So we get here again a contract that is similar to the one that a user would enter into with a data holder, whereby we include a number of extra provisos, for example, to make sure that the third party has been properly mandated by a user to get to the data that are related to the device of the user, a number of declarations in terms of what the third party can and cannot do. And as I said, the third party will need to respect also this non-compete situation and the trade secrecy rules. Here we have also Chapter 4 applying, but also Chapter 3, the B2B data sharing provisions, because here we will, by definition, be in a B2B sharing context. And here the IoT rules impose this contract to also respect the principle of the FRAND. FRAND standing for fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory terms. This is a set of customs, of principles that is actually derived from IP patent licensing, and which has been transposed. It's not always clear how this will work out. It's one of the questions we have. But so the idea here is that the data holder acts on the most fair terms with third parties in order to really allow for mobility of the data, flexibility of new services, so that the data holder cannot block third parties accessing new business models or new markets. And what is also interesting is that the data holder can charge a third party. There can be a compensation due by the third party, and that can also include a profit margin. So there is a business model right in there. This is a little bit the kind of general outline on what the IoT business will require in terms of, or IoT sharing business will require in terms of contractual underpinning. I think Anne mentioned already last week's publication of the new model clauses. Last week was also a bit of a shakeup in terms of new European legislation with the proposed digital omnibus, which has an impact on several of our digital law instruments, and it also has a bit of impact on our Data Act and on our relevant provisos that we discussed today. I briefly flagged them, but please note this is just a proposal. So we are not yet in a final stage of legislation. When it comes to refusing data sharing, then one of the reasons or one of the grounds that can be invoked by a data holder is high risk of serious economic damage. There will now be, or at least in the proposal, an additional ground to refuse a disclosure of trade secrets, namely when there is a high risk that the trade secrets are shared with a party outside the EU that, in addition, is situated in a jurisdiction where there is inadequate protection for trade secrets. Again, this sounds a little bit like we know from GDPR. You can only export data, personal data, out of the EU to a jurisdiction that offers adequate protection of these personal data in that third country. The same mechanism now is proposed for exporting IoT data covered by trade secrets to a jurisdiction that would not have adequate protection of trade secrets. As to the B2G data sharing, I will skip this, it's less relevant, but we will need to keep an eye on this proposal, and I think in any event, Beltug will continue to monitor the digital omnibus proposal as a whole. Now, let's look a little bit at what all of this means in practice. A few kind of critical notes, a few comments from my side. First of all, there is a rather minimalistic approach in that Data Governance Act in the Data Act when it comes to governance. For example, when it comes to trade secrets, we see that the mechanisms that are proposed to protect trade secrets are extremely complicated, and disputes can result out of that, and they would need to be settled by lengthy and costly procedures. We also are of the opinion that the protection of IP in the whole data sharing regulation is rather absent. There is not enough attention for the protection of IP rights. And we are also not very clear, or we find that the Data Act is not very clear on what the result is of a confidentiality agreement between, for example, a component manufacturer on the one hand and a device manufacturer on the other hand. If the device manufacturer is the data holder and is now subject to this mandatory data sharing, how does this relate to a contractual confidentiality clause that the data holder would have with an upstream supplier? So we think governance for those principles is rather minimalist and leaves lots of questions unanswered. We also think that the data holders can find loopholes in their obligations because of or by using design-based limitations. The Data Act requires them to share readily available data. Now, what is not readily available, or what should be readily available, is not described, and we think that the data holder has a large level of discretion to basically set its systems, to configure its systems in such a way that there is maybe less data readily available than one would expect. Second question we have is the data utility problem. How do we ensure that the data that will be shared are indeed useful and are brought in a way that it really is useful for example, the third party receiving it? There is no such real test as to how we can make sure that the data shared are useful. And the third thing which we find striking is there is no real choice. The user cannot choose as to whether he can find or receive the data in situ or ex situ, whether it's in the IT environment of the holder, for example, in the app, or via a separate file. It's the data holder who can decide how to go about this. And then finally, two more points that we actually stumble upon. Who is the data holder is something that will also continue to puzzle us. The criterion seems to be that it is the party that actually controls the access to the data, but this is something that we did not find in the Data Act itself. We found it in the FAQ, or in the frequently asked questions. So for us, here the issue is really, is that then becoming suddenly the criterion? As I mentioned in the beginning, we are now completely on the other side of the spectrum compared to GDPR, which is all about data minimization, which is about consent-based sharing, etc. And now mandatory sharing as an obligation, and we would rather say data maximization. That is a completely different philosophy. But the question is also, when in the Data Act reference is made to consent, does that then also require all the modalities of the free consent as we know it under GDPR? As a last slide, how do we go about all of this? We think it's important for every actor in this area, whether you are typically a data holder in a traditional manufacturing perspective, or whether you will be a new provider of services and very keen to get access to these data, we will all need to understand what the lay of the land is, who are the participants, what are their functions. Think about component manufacturers, think about original equipment manufacturers. Kalman will lead us into that area of practice. We will need to see how the relationships play out, where the labels are in a given configuration. And then what is going to be key is we will need to come up with the right contracts that meet the standards of the Data Act. We'll need to implement them and also make sure that we follow up on these contracts. They may need to be revised. New legislation definitely will come out. And last but not least, when then the actual request forms, the access request forms come in, we will need to have a process in place that allows for a smooth follow-up. This is what I wanted to share with you, and I will definitely have a look at the questions that would have been raised in the meantime, but I first will give the floor to Kalman.
I'm coming with, let you say, a positive look to what we are seeing at Data Act, and hopefully we can build what we are calling a data ecosystem, which will help us as companies to build this, let you say it, new businesses and new business models based on the shared data. So very shortly, I'm from TVH. I skip this my presentation. So I'm from TVH Group. Probably for those who never heard from TVH, we are market leader in distribution of spare parts of several industries, a large activities actually worldwide, and we are helping our customers to, let you say, to maintain and to repair their machineries in different industries. Certainly our core business started with the material handling, and after that going further in the industrial equipment, construction, and agriculture. So you can realize we are navigating what we are calling a whole machineries and technical stuff, which is really our core activities helping customer. But we have realized that our customer is not just requiring from us just spare parts, but more and more they're requiring knowledge which is related to the data produced by machineries. So if you are looking at the TVH, let you say, strategical building blocks, you will see at once that we are really aiming to become a data-driven organization. So it's quite ambition that we are doing, and certainly building new services. And this is what I'm talking about, because we have very clearly, and let you say, early, more than, let you say, 10 years ago, we have realized the potential of the data produced by those machineries. And certainly, you know that everyone is facing the same, in God we trust, and all others must bring data. This is what we are seeing today. So based on these elements, we have started gradually to build what we are calling a completely new digital business model, which is rely heavily in the data produced by those machineries that we are servicing already for the customers. Let's dig in a little bit what we are calling the digital business. So what does it mean, the digital business? So we have started actually with the web, and I had to tell you that the web for TVH started in the very early 93, when we have released our first web shop. And I have to tell you that today TVH is doing almost 85% of its daily business through the web. So we are probably the largest e-commerce company of Belgium. But all over the years, we are seeing this evolution until we are here, where we are seeing that the real economy actually is not just about people and business, but more and more people, business, and things. Things, it means intelligence, machineries, but you know, more and more we are moving the autonomous business way. The agents are showing up. This is the evolution, and this evolution is also reflected in our industry. Certainly, there's the material handling industry, which is coming from Linde, the large manufacturer in this domain, and what we are seeing that more and more the machinery is getting more and more built-in intelligence. What does it mean, intelligence? It means that they are operate and rely on data, but in the same time, this data is also is made available for the different users, and based on this collected data, you can build certainly interesting services. So let's take a look what we are calling the smart lift truck. So what does it mean? It means that you are seeing still a machinery, still a lot of components that is built up in the machineries that's made by what we are calling by an original equipment maker, in this case by Still. But in the same time, inside of the machineries, there are computers. There are already intelligence built up. There are already, let you say, electronic components are built up which can collect and transfer this data, which is generated by a lot of sensors or sensing technology inside of the machineries. What does it mean? So based on what we are calling this data, this is the IoT data, certainly you can build different models or harness this data and try to build different services, as you can see, actually from operational service, improving your operation, predictive analytics, and certain field service, knowledge services, as we are already certainly trying to build. So when we have started, it was much more for our internal industrial equipment, for much more for our own rental business, just starting to remote monitor those businesses, but gradually, and certainly this is a model that can be applied in, doesn't matter which IoT business model, start, let you say, with a couple of POCs, as we have started in my IT department almost 10 years ago, and gradually we have certainly grown to new business models. In this context, we have decided to build what we are calling the GemOne, which is a digital spin-off of TVH, really a native digital company using all cloud, native cloud services. And we heavily believe that data ecosystem where different parties are on this gameplay, sharing the data, will be a game changer. And this is where we are pretty much looking to the Data Act, enabling and certainly accelerating this ecosystem concept. And in this way, we can offer a much better customer experience and all kinds of other services. So what does it mean today, GemOne? So we are today, let you say, these figures that you can see in the screen, we are still growing, and GemOne in the meantime just one of the components, because based on the data we are also building other services, which is much more knowledge related services around the world. So what we are offering is all kinds of following the machineries where we are operating, of our customers operate, and increasing operational efficiency, reducing downtimes, and reducing certainly increasing the fleet utilization. Security, safety is a big topic, certainly in all those industries, because having what we are calling data-driven safety measures and cameras and follow-up system, check controls of the machineries, and finally the big interesting value coming to the service and maintenance, reducing the downtimes and certainly optimizing the whole planning maintenance. So you can imagine the machineries that we are servicing is much more in the categories what we are calling heavy equipment, off-road equipment. We are not targeting the automotive industries, and as you can imagine, those are mainly the core business equipment of TVH, but not only. So I have to tell you that in the meantime, we have a lot of other kind of industrial equipment which are not in the portfolio of the TVH, and certainly we are offering services as well. So let's take a closer look. What does it mean actually in real life? In real life, it means that there are a lot of machineries which are not coming with this magic box. This magic box is what we are calling the gateway box, where we are collecting actually and linking at first to the core network of the machinery, which is the CAN bus, because probably you know that all industrial machineries, but not just industrial machineries, but also automotive and all kinds, operates a kind of internal network which is called a CAN. So we are certainly at first, we are having those machines with dual CAN port. We are connecting to the core network of the machineries, collecting all kinds of data, but in the same time, we are also putting our own sensing technologies or or visualizing technology like screen of cameras or internal monitoring, positioning systems, or access control system, all kinds. So this is a little bit in a nutshell how this is quite complex build up. We are delivering the whole, let you say, setup and certainly the whole installation programming, because there are many machineries in the world operates without this magic box. However, in the nowadays, the new machineries are coming with this built-in box, which is collecting by the OM and sharing the data. And certainly this is where the story became very interesting, because at that moment we have not to build this whole network. We just rely on the data and we will build just related services. So if we are going a step more inside, so you can imagine that like in these machineries, we have the computer, so all different components, the brakes, the transmission, the engine are controlled by so-called ECUs, controlling unit. Those are real computers which are running software and certainly communicate with sensors which are built in the different components. And once that somebody, for instance, in your car, if in your car you are pushing the brake, suddenly the lights is starting, because inside of the machine the signal is sent through this controller. So what we are doing really, we are trying to go outside and collect what is happening in those systems. Why? Because unfortunately this is not given, it's not like that available. And this is what we are calling actually conversing. Conversing is quite complex and let you say cumbersome activity when you have to prepare your team. You have to locate your machine, because some special machines you cannot find next door. You have to let the team travel to the machinery, stay days on the machinery, all kinds of techniques and technology, collect as much as data that you can do from the machinery, get it in the office, analyze it, document it, and name it. And then finally, you are getting the protocols and the description, because this is unfortunately not documented or not standardized. And once that you have the data, you can build what we are calling, what we are also doing, your data value chain. So you have the different machineries generating what we are calling the raw data. Raw data, if the manufacturer really willing to share to API this data, so far it was the case, then is a very interesting story, because we have not to do this reversing as it's happening in GemOne. And also we are certainly acquiring or connecting external data sourcing, enriching the data. And finally, this is the big business where we are certainly sharing and selling knowledge, but also digital services. What is behind the whole structure? We have a so-called IoT platform where you have the machineries, you have the gateways. It means the communication, collection, all kinds of the devices. And then you have the platform with the different, let you say, data management. You have the streaming data, you have certainly stationary data, streaming analytics, and event-based process, so quite complex system. And finally, you have the application. So if you are going now, what does it mean? One of the well-known examples, what we are calling the predictive maintenance, it means that you are getting signals and events, because what happens in the machine is when somebody is taking an action, is generate an event. At that moment, we are getting something like that. So this is what we are getting out from the machineries. All kinds of, let you say, binary hex data, which without processing has no meaning. We are processing this data. We are analyzing real time, sometimes locally in the machine, because you have to take action. So the machine this is called edge actions of edge analytics. After that, you are getting in a more exploratory analysis where you are building all kinds of correlation in all kinds of models. And once that you have these models, you are deploying these models again back, if you can do that actually at the edge size. And this is a continuously turning job where you are going to the operations. And what really we would like to extend. As you are seeing, GemOne just one of the components. We are building different other components in what we are calling the new services, TVH Knowledge Hub, where the customers can really get information on the what is happening. I have an error code, what I have to do. I have to change my filter, how to do that. I have to do some other elements. So this is all about the TVH Knowledge Hub, TVH parts. Much it means I have this problem, which is the right spare parts to solve this problem. It will be solved with one. We have certainly already our TVH University, and certainly we have already our TVH hotline. This is all knowledge and, let you say, data-driven new business, what we are trying to build up for our customers. So is this something very easy? Not at all. So we are facing a lot of challenges, and certainly I have to tell you, because I'm already in this building this business and extending this business almost 10 years. So the biggest issue, lack of standard, because as you understand, those machineries unfortunately are not standardized. For instance, the automotive industry is very nicely regulated through the OBD, onboard diagnosis, or more and more machineries are coming, what we are calling the G1939 standard, is the heavy machineries. In the construction industries, they are IMP standard, they are not implemented yet all over. So this is a big issue. The second, lack of documentation, because if you are taking a service book from the manufacturer, you will find a very, let you say, small amount of information, because mainly this side is a core business of the OEM. So they are not really documenting and sharing with everyone what does it mean, or how to solve those problems. What does it mean, error code availability? You understand the machineries, the complex machineries built by original equipment makers are composed by products, OPMs, what we are calling original products maker. For instance, engine, transmission, hydraulic, let you say, displays, all those are controlled by such cards. And sometimes, for instance, the OPM is also like an engine manufacturer, offers such services and throwing error codes in the bus of the OEM, but those error codes, not all of them synced with the OEM. Sometimes the OPM can deliver much reliable information than the OEM. Reverse engineering, Reverse engineering, as I mentioned, is a complex and very costly operation. This is a big problem, that two-directional read-write operation. This is what actually also mentioned in the Data Act. It means that you are not just reading the CAN, but also you have to write to the CAN some operation, because otherwise you cannot get the data out. And sometimes, if you are saying, yes, I have to send let you say, write operation to the canvas, the OEM saying, wait a minute, you will lose the warranty. So this is also a heavy discussion with the OEM sometimes. Honestly, the data ownership, because sometimes we are talking about data ownership, however, that there is no data ownership, there is no legal ownership, there is a concept of data access. But some OEM say, no, the data is ours. So this is still a big discussion, mainly with US-based companies. And finally, we are facing really the problem with the service books. So it means that we would like really to get intelligence of the service books, building retrieval augmented system, rack system with AIs, but we are running against the problems of copyright. So therefore, when we are looking to the Data Act, definitely something that we hope that a lot of problems will get answered, maybe not in one single day, not in a single year, but in the years to come, we will really get this model that today the only aftermarket service you're getting mainly from the original manufacturer, where tomorrow actually this world is opening much open for other let you say players in the world as well. And you can see certainly this is what we are aiming to get, this quasi-monopoly broken and to go as third-party service providers. And still questions that we have still not answered and very maybe open for what we are calling the Q&A session. However, please, if you are getting my document, and probably you will be shared by Anne, you will get this link. There is a very new FAQ document from the Data Act with a lot of interesting answers for your question. A lot of questions that I had before are very nicely answered by this document, so I recommend to read that. However, what I'm not really understanding, why we are not pushing the industrial equipment manufacturer the same way as we have pushed the automotive industry to have these OBD standards, because standardization again is the key. How we can really take advantage of the data if not enough labeled of metadata or documented data is coming with the data. This is a big question mark, because today is not the case. Hopefully tomorrow it will be. What about the warranty, as I mentioned? Certainly this is what Eric tried to mention, how this whole contractual fair, all kinds of elements which are, see how will be in practice translated, how we will really, can some small players purchasing just a small machinery can go to a big guys from the OEM in a contractual relation. So we have to see that. The cost transparency, and certainly, as I mentioned, what will be the future of, because you understand, I can get the book, I can read the book, I can certainly write intelligence myself, but only once that you are saying, okay, I give this book to the AI to read it and to give me intelligence, then you're running against the EP protection, as Merrick mentioned as well. However, again, I'm really optimistic. I really believe that the connected ecosystem will be the future, not just for the customer, but also for the OEMs, because it means that they will get back a lot of interesting data from their machinery. So I'm just mentioning GemOne engine manufacturers produce thousands and thousands of engines which are operating worldwide. They have no clue. What we are doing now, we are really collecting this engine data and sharing back to the OPMs, for instance. They can improve their products. So it's profitable for everyone around the ecosystem. So this is what really we believe it will be the future. So this was my story. I tried to be as, let's say, quick as possible in order to open the floor for questions. Many thanks.